In this vault lies a forgotten world, the product of one of the most creative, extravagant, pleasurable periods of film production in this country, when the cinema was silent. These are images from films made by and starring a lost generation, directors, writers, technicians and actors whose work ought to be well known today. And we're lucky to have these films. Of the thousands made in Britain before 1930, only a few hundred survive.
The vast majority of them are preserved here in the archive of the British Film Institute. And the fact is, they rarely leave the premises. Most people who write about cinema for a living in this country have never bothered to view them.
Their attitude was shaped by the negative views of a tiny minority of critics whose crushing opinions of these films went unchallenged for years.
When you say the words silent cinema, most people think of Charlie Chaplin or D.W. Griffith or the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Very few think of anything filmed in these islands. That's because decades of prejudice and ignorance have robbed us of a sense of Britain's place in the history of cinema. But the language of the movies was created here. Britain produced stars who were hugely popular and made films that are genuine masterpieces. British silent cinema has remained unexplored for too long. So come with me on what I hope will be a journey of discovery and pleasure.
The cinema in Britain, as in every country, evolved over a long period. Before there were film images, moving pictures had been around for centuries. The Victorians enjoyed home entertainment systems like the zoetrope and were wowed by spectacular magic lantern displays. There was no eureka moment, so what we call the cinema evolved from different technologies developed by inventors scattered across the world. This is the American Thomas Alva Edison. He's gone down in history for giving us the light bulb, recorded sound, and the steel alkaline battery. In 1894, he presented one sort of moving picture to the public. A penny in the slot of one of his kinetoscope machines would yield half a minute of pleasurable cranking. Edison went on to claim that he invented the cinema and even persuaded a group of experts to sign a piece of paper saying that they agreed with him. They all received nice checks in the post. But the truth is, he was only really one of many contenders for the title. In fact, long before Edison's kinetoscope, there were three pioneers based in Britain who almost got their name on cinema's birth certificate. Three pioneers with three strange stories. This is Louis Le Prince, a Frenchman who set up home in Leeds, where, on this bridge, he made history.
In 1888, Le Prince constructed a camera that used light-sensitive paper to capture a few sets of fleeting images.
He managed to film traffic on the bridge, these 20 frames, but his attempts to project these images onto a screen all failed. 2 years later, Le Prince boarded a train in France and was never seen again. His widow was convinced he'd been bumped off by heavies hired by his American rival, Thomas Edison.
Well, the truth was probably rather less sinister. Le Prince had a secret, a debt with several noughts on the end, and it seems that at some point in his journey he decided that suicide offered a warmer comfort than the bankruptcy courts.
Next, there's the wonderfully named Wordsworth Donisthorpe, a man who believed in free love, smashing the state, and making movies.
He was a barrister who worked on a prototype movie camera, and by 1878 he was already suggesting a way of combining those images with recorded sound to make talkies. In 1890 he came here to Trafalgar Square to shoot a film.
Of an estimated 100 frames, only 10 survive.
Well, he couldn't get the funding to continue his experiments any further, and I've got a feeling that his politics may have had something to do with that. Being an outspoken anarchist doesn't really help when you're going cap in hand to the bank manager.
Finally, there's the controversial figure of William Freeze Green, who experimented with moving images in his laboratory in Brighton.
This tablet makes the bold claim that William Freeze Green was the inventor of cinematography, but just because it's written in stone doesn't make it true.
Freeze Green was a dogged inventor whose life was a sad saga of bankruptcy, litigation and marital argy-bargy, but a biographical movie suggested otherwise.
Now, what's that white sheet?
30 years after his death, the Bolting brothers made The Magic Box, a biopic of Freeze Green, which fueled the myth that he was the forgotten creator of the cinema. But this footage passing through his projector is phony, mocked up by the producers. It was a lovely idea, but the historical record argues that nothing like this ever happened.
For these inventors, the magic stayed trapped inside the box. They just couldn't crack the problem of how to project their images onto a screen. That's where the Lumiere brothers scored such a monstrous success.
The Lumiere brothers. They're always next to Edison in the history books. And in Paris, in 1895, they did make history when they gave the first cinema show to a paying audience.
When they brought their films to London in March 1896, thousands came to see their show here at the Empire Leicester Square.
This is the one that made the biggest impression, a train arriving at a station. It was a simple idea, the camera recording an event from everyday life in one shot lasting less than a minute. It's hardly gone with the wind, but in its day this was a sensation. It sent wannabe filmmakers scuttling off to the camera shops, determined to make their own movies. One of them was George Albert Smith, and he produced this early example of a cinematic homage, a train entering the station of his hometown, Hove. But this was just the beginning of his love affair with the camera. He would go on to invent the language of cinema. Smith was perfectly at home in the seaside playgrounds of the south coast. He was fascinated by science and magic. He had a stage act involving hypnosis and mind reading here at the Brighton Aquarium. He then took on the lease of a pleasure park, St Anne's Well Gardens in Hove. Smith brought wild animals to this park and employed a full-time hermit to sit in a grotto. But he also put on magic lantern shows, and then, armed with his own camera, the gardens became his studio and his backlot. It was here in 1898 that Smith made what was probably the first British sex comedy. It was all done in one shot. From this saucy little number, Smith made a great creative leap forward, as Frank Gray, a passionate advocate of the Brighton and Hove film pioneer, explained to me.
How do you take the next step? Well, clearly it's about editing. It's about the combination of shots. And I think the first best example we have that within Smith's career is A Kiss in the Tunnel. You're taking an audience from an exterior view of a train entering a tunnel, and then when you enter the tunnel, suddenly you're on board the train. And the illusion works.
And this notion of splicing together two images like that, that's absolutely revolutionary, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Smith's revolutions didn't stop at cutting between interiors and exteriors. Within a year, he was editing shots together to show us different points of view. He achieved this in a longer film called Grandma's Reading Glasses. It was all done with 3 simple ingredients: a small boy, an old lady, and a magnifying glass.
Can we see through that little boy's eye? No, but this is the illusion that you can. The film is cut together as if it's real time. When he looks at something, we see immediately what he looks at. This is what film can do. Film is not about a single photograph. It's not like a single painting. It's about a different understanding of space and time.
Smith's smutty sense of humour helped him to discover the new language of cinema. In Let Me Dream Again, he created the convention of the dream sequence. An elderly man is seen at play with a younger woman, and as the two of them canoodle, the image goes out of focus. When we come back into focus, we see the reality of the situation, the man in bed with his less glamorous wife. Nobody had used the defocusing of an image to take the viewer between dream and reality like this before. Now it's commonplace. These films, even the bed scenes, were shot on open-air stages. In 1903, Smith built himself a studio on this hill in the gardens, which meant a bigger set and more elaborate special effects, as you can see in Mary Jane's Mishap. The lady in the mob cap is Smith's wife, Laura Bailey, a veteran of the music halls. Don't try this at home. But see what he's doing here, cutting together 2 different size shots of the same view. It's as if we're drawing back from the stove because we know something horrible is going to happen. And here's what's known as a screen wipe. The Star Wars films are full of them. This is the world's first. When Mary Jane was being blasted up the chimney, Hollywood was just cacti and orange trees. Brighton and Hove were the world's centres of film production. And Smith had a friendly rival up the road in James Williamson. He was a chemist who was more interested in movie cameras than dispensing bottles of Dr. Collis's chlorodyne. In 1900, Williamson made what is probably Britain's first action movie, a dramatic reconstruction of a recent historical event. That year, the papers were full of accounts of the Boxer Rebellion, but you couldn't see the guns going off, even in the Daily Mail. I dare say that most of the audience knew that this wasn't really made in China, but they were thrilled by the big technical payoff here. Suddenly, with a change of camera angle, the Blue Jackets, played by local sailors, fire into our faces. The following year, Williamson took the idea a stage further in a film where Sussex didn't have to pretend to be Shanghai. Fire could be described as the world's first disaster movie. For the first time, a film used continuous scenes to create a thrilling narrative. Audiences were spellbound. The success of his films enabled Williamson to enter full-scale production at his newly built studio complex in Hove.
So the interiors were all filmed on a studio on this site.
Yes.
The exteriors were in the streets around us.
That's right. A great example of this use of external locations would be Our New Errand Boy of 1904, starring his son Tom. And Tom is the naughty boy. He upsets the pillars of society, from the banker, the vicar, a number of folk who all get very annoyed by his pranks. And then, of course, they begin to chase him.
We all remember the slapstick chases of the Keystone Cops, but they were filmed in Hollywood a whole decade later. Britain was there first, and short comedies and dramas like this were seen throughout the world, and Brighton wasn't the only place in Britain producing them. In 1903, the Sheffield Photographic Company made this film, Daring Daylight Robbery. 3 months after it was shown in New York, the film on the right, The Great Train Robbery, was produced by the Edison Company. It's not hard to see what the British film pioneers had set in motion. American directors were taking up their ideas, and in the struggle for cinematic supremacy, the shooting match had begun.
Most standard movie reference works will tell you that the Edison Company made the first narrative dramas, films like The Great Train Robbery and The Life of an American Fireman. But that's just another example of American culture colonising our consciousness. This country got there first. And in North London, there was one British filmmaker who proved that cinema could do anything.
Most viewers today would assume that this short film was made on a rather lovely toy train set. But when audiences first saw these locomotives smash into each other, they were convinced it was the real thing. At least, that's what the filmmaker Robert William Paul claimed many years later. Paul was a brilliant electrical engineer with a passion for galvanometers and celluloid. Ian Christie has been researching into Paul's life and works. I joined him in the North London suburb of Muswell Hill, where Paul built his film factory.
When he moved to Muswell Hill, it was really green fields. He bought some fields on the outskirts of what was beginning to be a little suburb, which is over there. And I reckon when he arrived here, that would have been standing. It's a dairy. We can still see the sign on the wall up there. He bought the site because he realized that he needed to build a permanent stage, and he needed something that, you know, had enough space around it. And the kind of films he was making were incredibly various. He made a Dickens adaptation around this time. He adapted The Last Days of Pompeii. He made all sorts of comic scenes.
Here's Paul's take on the popular myth that early audiences thought a filmed train might run you over in your seat, that the screen was somehow permeable. But within the world depicted by Paul's camera, all kinds of strangeness was possible. Invisible cuts allowed this man to be terrorised by phantom clothes. The camera could turn the world upside down. Most extraordinary is this fantasy that's one of the first space adventures in the cinema. Paul used miniature models and superimposition in a way that would still be employed decades later. And if it reminds you of the magical fantasies of the Frenchman Georges Méliès, give yourself a gold star, as Méliès bought his first camera from Paul. But Paul wasn't only interested in fantasy. Using his camera to observe reality led him on the path to documentary. In 1900, he made Army Life, of which this one fragment has survived. The film showed exactly what happened when someone joined up for the army, and for its time, it was an epic.
I think you could make a very good case for saying that Paul created the first big documentary. It must have run for between 40 and 50 minutes and was shown as a special event. There are lots
an immense length for the period, isn't it?
I mean, most films, remember, were 1 minute at this time. So this is a huge joined-up collection of 1-minute films with a special brochure with an introduction by the Adjutant General of the Army. It's a sponsored documentary, maybe, and maybe it's produced to encourage recruitment for the war.
These men are leaving to fight the Boer War, a territorial struggle in South Africa. This was the first media war, but with cameras held back from the action, Paul was forced to create his own battlefield on the fairway of Muswell Hill Golf Course.
Was he passing these off as real footage from the front?
Very concerned. In the catalogue, anyway, he said reproductions of scenes from the current war, filmed under the supervision of a retired army officer. But he then said later, in the 1930s, he couldn't be responsible for how the showmen used them.
Paul was thinking of the showmen who loved to sensationalise films, especially when they presented them at fairgrounds, like this one in Preston. At travelling fairs, moving pictures formed part of a continuum of entertainment with boxing matches and fortune tellers and five-legged calves in formaldehyde. Films were also screened in town halls or variety theatres, often sharing the bill with live turns. But wherever moving pictures were shown in those early years, they were thought by many to be just another novelty with a limited lifespan.
But by 1908, it was clear that cinema was here to stay. And this street, Cecil Court, in London's West End, was the nerve centre of the British film industry. Today, it's a rather cosy drag of specialist bookshops. But in the 1900s, it was known as Flicker Alley. Some 40-odd cinema businesses squeezed their way onto these premises. Production companies, distribution outfits, technology firms, even the people who made the ticket machines. This building here was the headquarters of Quo Vadis Films. That was United Kingdom Films Limited. And over there was the Globe Film Company. This was the Silicon Valley of the early British film business. Oddly, though, its Bill Gates figure never set foot here.
This is Charles Urban, a plausible boy from Cincinnati, Ohio, with a taste for salesmanship and strong tobacco. He'd been a smoker from the age of 6 and touted everything from atlases to phonographs to pin-ups of great Victorian actors. He also sold Edison kinetoscopes, which was the business that brought him to Britain in the summer of 1897. By 1903, he'd set up on his own. The slogan of the Charles Urban Trading Company recalled his early days selling atlases door to door in nowhere American towns. We put the world before you. Urban was passionate about making science popular, and among his greatest successes were the bizarre and beautiful nature films directed by Percy Smith. This one was a kind of macabre comedy in which various insects glued to their backs performed circus tricks for the camera. Smith was an obsessive. He stuffed his house so full of horticultural and cinematographic paraphernalia that his wife had to move into the garden shed. For Mrs. Smith's discomfort, we must be grateful. Without her indulgence, we wouldn't have Smith's exquisite film Birth of a Flower, an early example of time-lapse photography, now the mainstay of natural history films. In 1908, Charles Urban felt confident enough to set up new offices in Wardour Street. In doing so, he created the nerve centre for the British film industry for years to come. And though most of the major companies have now dispersed to different parts of London, the old signs linger on. Urban's greatest triumph was his film of the Delhi Durbar, a spectacular ceremony to celebrate King George V as the Emperor of India. The film showed off Urban's patented two-colour process, known as Kinemacolor, and it was presented exclusively at the Scala Theatre in London. It formed part of a multimedia spectacular with an orchestra and chorus, bagpipes and live sound effects. The theatre was decked out like the Taj Mahal, and the whole show ran for an unprecedented 2.5 hours. To Urban's frustration, Kinemacolor soon went out of fashion. It just wasn't quite colourful enough. He returned to America to run a studio in a burgeoning centre of filmmaking called Hollywood. His showmanship had given a real boost to the British film industry. But if one man could be considered its founding father, it was a former protégé who had been fired by Urban in 1899, Cecil Hepworth. Hepworth saw that making movies himself was the answer. In 1900, he moved to the Surrey village of Walton-on-Thames, where he inaugurated the first full-scale British studio. Soon, they were producing over 100 films a year. Here's how Walton has chosen to memorialise him. The original studios are somewhere under a multi-storey car park. The only surviving building is the one that housed the generators. Hepworth began by making trick films and larky fantasies. Comic car crashes were a speciality. And he shook the world by fitting his camera with a system of swinging weights. But Hepworth went beyond the limits of cinematic convention with this film, Alice in Wonderland. It's as if the original Tenniel illustrations have come to life. You could buy this film scene by scene, or show the whole story as one 12-minute movie. And that, in 1903, made Hepworth the producer of the longest fiction film ever.
But his main legacy lies in his decision to name the actors featured in his films, to change them from anonymous faces to film stars. And Britain's first film star, the world's first film star, was a young, bright-eyed performer who spent much of his career sprinting around the streets of Walton-on-Thames. The posthumous revelation that he liked to eat shaving soap should not be allowed to dim his triumph, nor should the fact that he was a dog.
His name was Blair, and he was the Hepworth family sheepdog. He played the title role in Rescued by Rover, a breathless melodrama about a baby kidnapped by an old beggar while the nanny is distracted by a nice man in uniform. After the distraught nanny confesses all, Rover sets off to track down the missing infant. Rescued by Rover remains enormous fun. The brisk editing and visual repetition can still create tension and satisfaction. And it was a phenomenal success. Almost 400 prints were sold worldwide, which, for a modern comparison, is the same as the distribution on the full Monty. It had to be reshot twice, as the demand for prints wore out the negatives. Blair's search for the baby isn't a conscious piece of acting on his part. He's actually expecting to find sausages behind these doors, and when he doesn't, he moves on to the next. Although little exists today of the rural paradise that was once Walton-on-Thames, one location is recognisable. After discovering the house where the baby is held, Rover returns across the stream, which was just here by this marina off the River Thames. Rescue by Rover was, in keeping with Hepworth's early films, a family affair. The father was played by Cecil himself, the mother by his wife Margaret, and the baby was their daughter Barbara. But the actual director of the film came from a theatrical background, Lewin Fitzhamon. Here he is playing Dick Turpin in another Hepworth production. Fitzhamon had been a jockey and an actor in touring melodrama, but as a director he had an instinctive understanding of how cinema worked, and he showed this brilliantly in the Tilly films. These were a series of 10-minute anarchic comedies featuring two apple-cheeked, bowed and beribboned schoolgirls. In Tilly's party, the girls invite a pair of sailors into their nursery, but they don't seem to want them as boyfriends, just to help them put on their roller skates, knock over their parents and smash up the furniture. The anarchic, freewheeling character of the Tilly films proved so popular that over 5 years, 20 of these comedies were made. This is Tilly and the Fire Engines, in which the two girls brought mayhem to the streets of Walton-on-Thames. According to Fitzhamon, his young actresses came up with even more outrageous ideas than he did. Nobody told these extras that they would end up quite as wet as this. The Tilly girls were played by the teenage Chrissy White and Alma Taylor, who stayed faithful to Hepworth and became his leading ladies. Hepworth built up a stock company of stars and created an aura around them through the studio's official magazines. These were the first extensive use of media publicity, trumpeting the high quality of his productions to an increasingly curious public. But at the time, none of his actors was actually allowed to give press interviews or make personal appearances. Years later, Chrissy White reflected on the experience of being one of the world's first film stars.
We weren't allowed to be grand at all, and he didn't like publicity. We weren't allowed publicity at all. But I think that's really why, in a way, I think people, sort of thought we were sort of something apart. Because I remember ages afterwards, my husband and I went in somewhere, and people in a restaurant, people came up and said, "Oh, do you eat?" They just sort of, couldn't believe that we were real people.
Hepworth's films showed the way forward for the cinema, with fully developed stories and prestigious casts. Now, a trip to the pictures became more than your fourpenneth of dark. It was a complete show that was beginning to attract people like this, middle-class women in picture hats. The first purpose-built cinemas began appearing in Britain in 1909, when local authorities were given the power to set safety standards. They wanted to avoid fires, which were numerous and nasty thanks to the incredible volatility of celluloid. But they also wanted to monitor what the public saw. Within 5 years, 4,000 cinemas were operating in Britain. Movies were now the leading form of mass entertainment, with 7 million tickets sold every week. And as audiences got bigger, so did the pictures, and the first historical epics galloped into cinemas, Ivanhoe and the Battle of Waterloo. This was described by one newspaper as the first great British film. It was also one of the first films made in Britain to run for over an hour, and the surviving fragments, which seem to be unedited rushes or outtakes, certainly give you some idea of the scale of the enterprise. It was filmed on meadows outside Northampton. 300 unemployed local men played the infantry, 300 horsemen played the cavalry, and dozens of dead horses played themselves. The knackers had a good day. And so did the parodists. Comedians were instantly sending up these films. Fred Evans, otherwise known as Pimple, struck the first blow. Note how Evans was keen to portray the moving relationship between Napoleon and his horse Marengo, who, in this version, contrary to history, is the first casualty of the battle. In 1914, a real war was declared, and 2 years later, images of a genuine battle would finally make it to the big screen. This documentary film, The Battle of the Somme, was commissioned by the government. They wanted to record the everyday details of a momentous military action. On the 1st of July 1916, British soldiers began their advance towards the German line. By the end of the day, there had been 58,000 casualties, a third of them fatal. Just 2 weeks after they were filmed, these images were shown in cinemas all over the country, while the battle itself was still being fought. 20 million people went to see the film. That's almost half the population of Britain. Police had to be called to some cinemas to control the crowds. Newspaper reports show how audiences now felt they could distinguish between real battlefield footage and the kind of dramatic reconstructions they were offered during the Boer War. But is it real? You'll have seen this scene in countless documentaries about the First World War, but it's now claimed that it was faked. This isn't Muswell Hill Golf Course, but the soldiers fall rather casually to the ground. One even crosses his legs. Nevertheless, spectators were deeply moved, and the film achieved its propaganda goals. Audiences responded with sympathy and pride.
When the Great War ended in 1918, British filmmakers had another battle to fight, with Hollywood. The cameras had begun turning in California in 1911, and a few years later, D.W. Griffith made the first big-screen epic, Birth of a Nation, that ran for 3 hours. Soon, all the companies that still run the show today, outfits like Fox and Warner's and Paramount, were selling their products to the world. And they had some pretty crafty ways of nobbling the opposition, practices like blind block booking. If British cinema owners wanted the latest American blockbuster, then they had to agree to show a load of other minor American films without even knowing what they were. So Hollywood got what it wanted. British films were slowly being squeezed from British cinemas.
While Hollywood films flooded the market, one man at least felt British pictures had a great future. Sir Oswald Stoll was a teetotal music hall impresario, noted for his dislike of both bad language and writing out big cheques. But he'd taken music hall up market, and he aimed to do the same with cinema. When the Stoll Studios in Cricklewood in northwest London opened in 1919, they were the largest in Britain. Stoll realised that well-known literary characters were at dead cert at the box office, so he called in Sherlock Holmes. This was the first British version of The Hound of the Baskervilles, and you're seeing it here with the original tinting and toning restored. And that phosphorescent glow around the Hound was achieved by taking a scalpel to the actual film stock. The star of Stahl's 40-odd Holmes films was Eiley Norwood. He was born Anthony Brett. His stage name was an eccentric tribute to a lover named Eiley, who lived in Norwood. Norwood became obsessed by the role, shaving his temples to make himself look more intellectual. To a 1920s audience, this man was Sherlock Holmes. Norwood is forgotten today, but then so are many of his once equally popular contemporaries. This is Guy Newell, not a pretty boy, but loved by audiences for his command of screen acting, particularly when he appeared opposite his wife, the rather better-looking Ivy Duke. In The Lure of Crooning Water, Duke plays a nervy London actress who takes a rest cure on a farm. Her visit disrupts the peaceful existence of her hosts. She gives cigarettes to the baby. And she charms the farmer, played by Newell, who becomes infatuated with her. The film's intense sensuality and subtle acting mark it out as a great rediscovery in British cinema. I watched The Lure of Crooning Water with Bryony Dixon, curator of silent films at the National Film Archive.
What do we know about the critical reception of the film? Was it well received?
It was enormously popular. It was a critical success and a popular success. People thought, the one word they use about it is quality. They thought it was an intelligent film. It looked beautiful.
That's such a wonderful image, isn't it? So well composed, and the detail of it's extraordinary. The light is wonderful. I mean, I feel I can see every leaf in that image.
Yeah.
He's got an unusual face for a leading man, though, isn't he? I mean, he's rather.
Yes,
he's no looker, is he?
He certainly isn't. No, he's a jolly lad, I think, but powerful. And quite appealing to women, clearly.
Well, he had a big female following, didn't he?
Yeah, he certainly did. And
his marriage made him glamorous too, didn't it?
Absolutely, to this lady here. They married 2 years after this film was made. And it was clearly a passionate marriage. It didn't last. There's this touch.
Look at that. Look how that's such a sensual movement, isn't it?
Delicately done.
Guy Newell was once called Britain's finest actor, not, you'll note, Britain's best looking. Both he and Ivy Duke were adored at home. But films like this were rarely appreciated across the Atlantic. Few in Hollywood would have bothered returning a call from either of them.